Welcome to the 52nd episode of the First Person Podcast. This month, we're going to be talking about video game preservation and the industry. We have brought on special guest Alex Fleck to talk about his work in this relatively new academic realm. From archiving to modding to emulation, FPS will be exploring the intricacies of maintaining some of your favorite titles. Now, before we begin, who are you all, and what have you been playing recently?
Hi, so I'm Andrew Bailey. I'm the section head of essays at First Person Scholar, and I just started playing Total War Warhammer 3 just came out, so I'm dipping my toes into that, maybe about 4 hours or so in, and then I think I know a few other people are. I'm excited for Elden Ring is coming out, so I'm planning on that being my main game for the next little while. So that's what I've been playing.
Hey everybody, my name is Colin Welsh. I'm an assistant editor in the commentary section, and lately I have been glued to my Oculus Rift headset. No one game in particular, a lot of VR chat, but I'm getting real invested in the metaverse, let's say.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex. I used to be the podcast producer for FPS. I've been playing Aladdin for the Super NES and Genesis. Comparing them, which has been fun. And what else? I play Halo on and off again. Halo came out a couple months ago, so a bunch of that still.
And I'm Giuseppe Femia, or Joey, and I'm the podcast producer for FPS, the current one. I have been playing Dungeons & Dragons on a lot of it recently, both as a player and a DM, and I'm having a great time with it.
And hi, guys. Last but not least, it's Patrick, and I am the co-EIC, and just last night I started playing this game called WRC9. It's like World Rally Championship. I'm very bad. I'm not good at sim racers, but I wanted to buy one that had really cool PS5 feel in the controller, and it does. And then I just discovered today that I can just blast whatever music from a USB on my PS5 while I play, so I feel like I will be cruising over tracks badly and listening to, I don't know, software or something like that, some ambient thing.
All right, now that everyone's introduced, we can start with the questions. Alex Fleck, this will be more directed to you, but anyone can chime in at any point. So let's start off. Our first question is, how have the bigger companies in the industry been helping the gaming community to preserve their games? And more often than not, how have they not?
I think that second part is pretty telling. So in the last few years, it's kind of slowed down now, but the major example I was going to point to has been sort of the trend in what you would call collections and remasters, things that sort of function like emulation, software emulation. So collections on Steam, like the Disney Afternoon Collection. So some of the big companies that license their properties have been doing some of that stuff to make some money. Pretty typically, there's been a bunch of Konami ones, Mega Man collections. Those are good examples. On the hardware side of things, a little bit on the hardware, software too, is the mini consoles. So that's, I think like 2016 is the NES Mini, and then a few every year, a couple every year since then. Stopped a couple of years ago. Again, I don't remember the dates exactly, but NES, Super NES, Genesis, TurboGrafx, a bunch of SNK ones that are fairly popular, but people think of them as a little less popular than the major Nintendo stuff, for example. That's a place to start, I think. That's one thing they're doing. How haven't they is another question that we can answer with sort of community things, but yeah.
I can jump onto that one. I feel like that's kind of like an easy transition point for talking about at least Nintendo's maybe like less than helpful actions. I think when we were originally planning on scheduling this essay or this podcast, it was a little while ago, but it was well timed at least for this kind of discussion, because it is in the last maybe week or two that Nintendo announced that they were discontinuing their Wii Shop and 3DS support, which I think spurred a lot of conversations, at least within my social media feed, about Nintendo and its relationship with video game preservation and kind of how to make its own history accessible to its fans, and increasingly how it's either not doing that and kind of closing it off, or repackaging it within these kind of online services or the mini consoles. But even then, that's not really like it's a very small sliver of kind of their own history and what they've released on their consoles. So I don't know. I definitely I thought that would be. I don't know if anybody has any specific thoughts about that more recent news or just Nintendo's longer history of litigation against its fans who are doing emulators and ROMs and all that. But that's definitely the more maybe like less helpful side of Nintendo, at least as one company.
I have a decent metaphor, I think, for people that are listening that just don't know sort of like how small a slice that slice is that they have been preserving. I think of Nintendo and some of the other major companies as basically just releasing the hits. It's like a greatest hits album that they re-release every few years. So it's Nintendo Online, or in some cases, the Virtual Console has been better than that. The ones that are closing, like the Wii U one, and the ones that have already closed, like the Wii one, which closed in 2019. But yeah, they're sort of just like a record company that's sort of like throwing out the hits every few years to make sure everyone's still invested. Nintendo Switch Online is one I didn't mention, but it's a thing they do right now, where you pay a monthly fee or a yearly fee, and you get Nintendo and Super NES games, and then there's an expansion pack, quote unquote, with N64 and Genesis. And the games are sort of their choice. They curate them. I think choice is a big sort of factor in how that works. So it's like it's not necessarily the games you had and loved as a kid yourself, because those could be terrible by any other standards, but also have nostalgia and value for you. So it's kind of like their choice and very limited. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, on that point, I mean, referring to Nintendo as a records company that releases, a greatest hits catalog every few years, I don't think I've ever heard such an appropriate or apt comparison. And you were just speaking about like, this Nintendo Switch Online service, and I know there's been a general kind of air in the community that I just kind of want to say, especially the new expansion hasn't been received too well, both in terms of the selection of the games and both the quality of the emulation, this official emulation from Nintendo, when they've already proved many times in the past that they have the tool sets and the capabilities to produce a better product. I think you then kind of start getting into conversations about, the importance of authenticity, both in software and in hardware, in terms of these games as experiences, right? Like, in as much as our view of them might be shaded by or tinted by the lenses of nostalgia, I still think it's important from an academic standpoint to be able to have authentic examples to study and examine in these contexts.
I'll jump in again. I had it further down on my list of notes for some of the questions we were thinking about, but I always love looking at the notion of authenticity as it applies to, especially to video game preservation, and like looking at I don't know, academic scholarship and how that concept is tackled, but also more broadly just with like any sort of like digital art or media preservation, just because there's so many factors that go into like how somebody decides what exactly authentic is, and like if it's material authenticity, and like if it's the original hardware, or like how authenticity is determined, I think is such an interesting question, especially from an archival or institutional, like thinking about how a library or museum might to think of, because it seems like a slippery term.
It's one of those things where I don't think it ever ends. You can go down the rabbit hole and try to find the most authentic version. But just like as a setup to think about, say, preserving like the experience of playing a Super Nintendo when I was a kid, you'd have to have the same sort of Zenith tube TV that's 5 to 10 years older than it should be probably. And you'd have to be using RF out, and you'd have to, have the particular, Super NES, which had different board revisions that I had, and be listening through the same speakers. There's so many just tweaks and hardware things, like to replicate that exact experience is at this point impossible. The question sort of becomes like, where do we place our reference points in terms of what counts? So the hardware people are very interested in having tools to sort of compare. So one of the community members that I'm interested in following, oh God, I forget his name. I can look it up. But he does a piece of software called MD Fourier. And basically this is a way to compare the frequency, like the sound coming out of your consoles. So they can sort of determine a baseline for, like what does a Sega Genesis sound like? Like what is the actual sort of, technical waveform in terms of how that works? And there's some other models too. There's Model 1 Genesis and 2 and 3. So it's like, which one is authentic? And the answer is, whichever in the end feels good. the question of authenticity, maybe we can talk about the mini consoles and as a reference point there as well. But I mean, if for anyone who's playing these games and it sort of is a fun experience, especially if you're new, I think the mini consoles are great. Like, I don't know. It really depends on what your expectations are in the end, where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, and I guess on that point, like it really is kind of almost a personal experience for people and the biases that you're coming at it with. Like I know me as a crafts-based person and someone who's an aspiring conservator, the reference points I base for authenticity might be a lot further along than what others might place. I might have a much more strict definition. Um, and you know, on that point, like these mini consoles, in terms of entry points into retro gaming, yeah, they are excellent. But for myself as a purist, I could go on at length about the problems I have with not just them, but emulation in general. And I am someone who, you know, emulates software and games all the time in order to enjoy them in a modern context.
I think if we go back to authenticity and sort of like preserving things, I find I hear this a lot, and you guys probably heard it a lot. Think about like retro games. It's just like people don't necessarily want games as they were. They want them sort of as they remember them. So like if we are to, you know, I mean, a Game Boy is a good example. If we were to play, you know, like nostalgia goggles, sorry, in the chat Alex put, but yeah, if we were to play like a you know, a DMG Game Boy, you know, Final Fantasy Legends 2, it's so hard to see it. It's so blurry. You know, like you might enjoy the form factor, but when you actually get your hands on like an original DMG Game Boy, it's really laborious to play. And this might maybe go into our next question, where it's like, what do people prefer in terms of like preservation? When you think about preference, it's like people tend to prefer the mini consoles because they're easy. You set them up. You have pixel perfect modes. You have this sort of what's the term, like a CRT mode, which isn't authentic, but it's easy and it's there.
There's a convenience factor, I would say, for sure. And it really depends on what you want from the experience. Like, I don't know. If you're someone who, maybe the way to do this is just to think about who the audience is and who various people could be that might want something different or the same. So I think the average person who hasn't touched one of these consoles in 25 years, like they stopped playing the Super Nintendo when the N64 came out, they're not going to really remember there being a great difference when they're playing Super Mario World or whatever and sort of jumping and doing stuff. For the person who's been speedrunning it like every day since, they're going to really know the difference. And I think those are the sort of sides of the spectrum, if that makes sense. If you're somewhere in between, you might feel that something's off or weird about playing games on software emulation. Not to say that it isn't accurate in many ways, but it's not quite the same. And they're getting to the point where they can get it there, but it's not, you know, always that way. Especially the mini consoles are a bit underpowered. Like they're a consumer product aimed at a certain price point that they had to make, basically, which is interesting in its own right. I think it's cool that the website for the mini consoles, they're just still up. All those websites, they just have PDFs of the manuals, which I thought was awesome. I downloaded them immediately. I'm like, Nintendo's going to take these away. I'm going to download all these like first party manuals that they probably got from their archive. Any peek into their archive is like a thing I'm very excited about.
That's interesting because there is what is it, World of Nintendo Power, where this is a guy who's collecting like Nintendo Power, you know, like
magazines,
yeah, and like art and stuff. So like that's interesting. I'm curious. I don't know if we can find out what everybody prefers, but I'm curious, people here, what do you prefer to play, to preserve, or to play games?
So what I've actually put in the chat and to give some people like kind of a perspective on what I enjoy as like someone again who is an aspiring conservator or someone who is looking to work in the field of public history and sometimes look at how I can bring games into that. I really do prefer the authentic raw experience, especially as it in regard to like, you know, an arcade experience. But in terms of what I want at home in the comfort of my living room and in my, you know, my little den or my games area, I want my emulators. I want my MAME cabinet. I want ease of access, and I want a modern experience.
I would say the same. I think it's making me think of going back to play older games. I tend to like companies like Night Dive Studios or other companies that are specializing in bringing forward old games, but maybe modifying the control schemes to kind of in a way that's more familiar to like contemporary control schemes or interfaces. But as far as like that's just as a preferring as a player, but my preferred like thinking about it in a more of a like historian or scholarly, like kind of like more of an institutional way. I've always really been partial to the idea, and it calls back because we were just talking about like the Nintendo Power collecting or magazine collecting, but finding ways to collect paratextual material and also finding like making space for archiving let's plays or documentation of play, just so that I don't know, like there's going to be instances I think where like certain games may for whatever reason become inevitably lost, like just because they haven't been brought forward or whatever, or like there might just not be an authentic like physical original, whether it be through bit rot or like plastic decay or whatever. So like having archives of like the cultural material surrounding a game, I think is also like equally valid and kind of, at least in my own experience for research, I think that's a lot of what I glom onto. But yeah, I think ease of access for play, whatever feels the best is typically the newest for me.
Yeah, I find feel is huge for me, and like feel in sort of like an aesthetic sense, meaning like feel as in to touch, like just the body and sight connection. So like I used to collect sort of old systems, even like to the like Commodore 64, which I kind of wish I still had. But what I have instead, what I've decided, because I live in an apartment and can't have all these systems, is just like a series of controllers. So like the 8-bit DOE controller, I have a number of those, that number being, I think, 3. But and like a Sega Saturn like retro bit controller, and then I just kind of play everything on my PC connected to my television and kind of put on whatever filter feels the right to me. Like for example, I was playing what's that Hideo Kojima game? I really narrowed it down there. Snatcher, yes. I was playing Snatcher on the Saturn controller because that's very close to like a Sega Genesis controller, and I had like CRT Royale, which is like a really fantastic filter on RetroArch, and it's like, oh, this is perfect for me, what I need. Like it's no way exactly like watching it on my old CRT back at home, but it's definitely has that nice feel.
And in the end, I mean, what else can matter? I guess it's definitely one of those things. I don't know. There are spaces where like the speedrunning community would take sort of not umbrage. What's the way to say this? They would sort of have some issue with using certain platforms if you wanted to claim that you'd done a speedrun, because that's a different sort of environment, of course. But then they just have a listing. It's like, this is the platform you can use or that you should use if you want to participate in the competition or whatever. And I think that works out fine for everyone, because there's emulated ones as well. They have different sort of strands. I don't know, everyone probably knows about it by now, but Games Done Quick, they'll usually, I think, have a listing of what it's being played on and how, so that you can replicate it if you want to practice yourself.
And you know what? I think on that point, the speedrunning community is kind of a great community to look at when we talk about, those more strict reference points for that concept of authenticity. And I see on our list of topics here that we haven't brought up yet is field programmable arrays, like these customizable pieces of hardware that in theory can lend you to have like an original hardware accurate experience on what is tangibly a mini console. That's something that I really think is going to be incredibly important to the future of video game preservation and conservation, both from a hardware and software perspective.
Can the people who are more familiar with FPGA, the field programmable graphical array, is that yeah? I just noticed FPGA. Can you guys talk about that more? Because I feel like that's not something that like people outside of like the hobbyist or collector community really know about.
Sure, I can. People can jump in with other details if they want. So FPGA is field programmable gate array. I don't know what each of those words means, to be fair, but I know that it's a hardware development board, and it was originally used to prototype. It was an industrial thing. It was used to prototype. So, for example, the original SNES was probably programmed on an FPGA before it went to production run. So it's the kind of thing that a big manufacturer, I mean like a chip manufacturer, will use to like design their boards. So you're not like making a new board every time to change your design. So what it does is it's supposed to emulate or simulate. Again, the terms are interesting. We can get into that. Another piece of hardware on the electrical level. So as opposed to on the software level where it's sort of mimicking its behavior, it's actually doing the same sort of electrical connections in all the ways that it can. And that's sort of the limits of my technical knowledge of how it works. Where it's been applied, though, the community has run with it in a major way with a project called Mr. FPGA. And then there's a GitHub and a wiki and a bunch of other stuff. Maybe there's a spot for links at some point. But this community has basically been writing cores, and they call them cores in the sense that you basically flip a switch. And it's a software switch, to be fair. And then you can, turn your Mr. FPGA board, which is it's called a DE10 Nano. Again, we'll get in the weeds with specifics, but it's like a specific kind of board that they use for this project. You flip a switch and it becomes a Genesis and it becomes a TurboGrafx, it becomes an NES. And it's all based on sort of volunteer coding from people who have designed these cords. So they understand the programming language for this kind of board. And they've replicated, the hardware of a Super NES in there, basically. Yeah. Maybe that's too technical, but that's where we're at. So it's like think of it as hardware emulation, whereas your average RetroArch or other sort of computer piece of software is software emulation, and there are advantages to each.
And I think that's really kind of what makes me more intrigued by FPGAs than traditional emulation methods or preservation methods, let's say, is really that insight you get into how the hardware works. And I think that's, again, going to be invaluable moving forward as we start to lose these original and authentic examples of hardware, and we become more reliant on modern solutions and like FPGAs or these software solutions that we've been talking about via emulation.
The problem with the FPGAs, they're not for everyone. I feel like there's maybe like a class thing involved because they're typically expensive. Like the easiest ones you can buy are Analog, which is a company that makes a bunch of like FPGA ones. They're not switchable like the Mister, but I feel like these are quite expensive. I know that the Analog stuff is.
Yeah, it's definitely the price of entry is definitely higher. I mean, so it depends again where the bar goes for you. So if you wanted to take all the systems that the Mister project emulates, including old computers, by the way, like Apple II, Commodore, a lot of the British ones, Acorn, all of these sort of old platforms, if you wanted to take them and buy them and sort of use them in the way that is hardware quote accurate. Again, it depends on the programmer who designed the core. Then it would cost way more than the cost of a Mister. But yeah, just for a ballpark, I think I was looking at putting together a Mister FPGA thing with all the sort of board add-ons and stuff to make it work sort of with as much as possible, and then to have analog video out if you want that. You're looking at like, in the end, like 600 USD, something like that. That's presuming you can get all the parts and that sort of thing. So when you look at like a Raspberry Pi as an alternative option, there's an appeal there, of course. And yeah, accessibility is not fantastic. I've been looking periodically just to see if certain things are in stock. And yeah, like even just knowing that you have the money and you're prepared to make that commitment, you can't necessarily get one at the moment anyway.
The RetroPie is interesting, or the Raspberry Pi, because that is like that's even cheaper than like the the mini consoles, and you can put everything on it with the know-how, but there's like a lot of like fiddling around. I don't know. I mean, I've had a RetroPie and I've just elected to just use my computer because it's easier. Because I mean, half of the joy / problem with the RetroPie is like you spend most of the time, if not half the time, just like messing around with it, and then there's this sort of like shopping for images or like what to add on to it. So that's another thing that also like it's almost like the best ways to emulate or simulate are have these big barriers of entry, whether it's like messing around with Linux or like having some kind of technical know-how.
So again, thinking about so if a Raspberry Pi is essentially, and they're very similar, I think it's actually just a cheaper board inside the mini consoles. But if you were to buy all the mini consoles and then compare it to the monetary cost there, I think you're ahead by doing the Raspberry Pi method. But you're right that for as many sort of leaps and bounds of accessibility they've made, like there's an entire OS, an image for the Raspberry Pi that sort of makes it a front end for emulators, which is meant to simplify things. It's not nearly as simple as the product Nintendo puts out or Sega. I think M2 actually makes the emulation products, or did for Sega, at least, and the TurboGrafx. So the interface and everything is just sort of plug and play. So if it's really just about getting a chance to play games that you haven't in a long time, or you never have, then going with those solutions, I think, makes more sense in the end.
Yeah, and there is always something to be said about that seamless experience, right? And it seems like we keep going back to this balancing act between accessibility and authenticity, or something in that regard, right? So I think that's a lot of what the conversation of this is about, is when does that authenticity become prohibitive? When does the ease of access become more important? And, other analogous topics.
It made me think of something kind of surrounding these three topics of access and authenticity and price, so the barrier to entry. But something that I think is maybe a little bit more of a recent development that I've heard people talk about, like in person, and seeing people on Twitter making tweets about it. But over the last, it seems, a couple of years, maybe more so in the pandemic, but that the price of trying to act as a collector, for trying to get access to original discs and original cartridges, it seems like the monetary value for original authentic games, or games hardware, like old collectors items, are becoming increasingly more like collectors items in a prohibitive way. The prices seem to skyrocket quite a bit lately, and I'm just curious if, yeah, maybe anybody has opinions on that, or has tried collecting over the pandemic or in recent years and noticed those changes, or anything like that.
I've definitely fallen out of retro collecting, but I was quite into it, and I still kind of listen to podcasts and look into sort of collecting and stuff like that. Yeah, the pandemic happened. I don't know if you've heard of this, but all of a sudden, like, retro game prices shot up, and they've just sort of been climbing, kind of like plateauing recently. But yes, then now there has been this other. So there were like collectors, and now this other one that collectors are calling speculators, that have moved into the hobby. And it has been sort of big named games being sold for like about $1 million. I think was one of the highest ones, a bit over $1 million for like Mario 64. And it's kind of, you know what? I think I'm going to cede to Colin and Fleck. Oh, sorry, Fleck. I was about to say Fleckall, because that's your thing. Colin and Alex, actually, you guys are talking in the chat, so maybe you guys want to talk more about this.
On the subject of like how these prices seem to have skyrocketed since the beginning of the pandemic, there actually is a lot of, at least seems to be a lot of market manipulation when you kind of look under the surface here. And I don't recall too many of the specifics about it, but there is a really popular YouTuber who I think he normally does like speedrunning content and stuff like that. Like, he's embroiled in the big lawsuit with Billy Mitchell right now. That's the Donkey Kong guy, for those uninformed or unaware. But yeah, he does a great video that kind of, it's an expose on a lot of this, about how basically these prices are just artificially inflated. And it's kind of the same way that, and it's funny me saying this as someone who's involved in the the world of high art and craft or whatever too. But it's kind of, the prices on a lot of this stuff are inflated in a similar context to the way they do in like a fine art market. Like, somebody will buy this piece and then put it up for auction, and then their buddy will buy it back from them at like 10 times the price, right? But we don't know what's happening behind closed doors after these transactions take place. And he hints very heavily that they just basically go back into the hands of the original owner and no money is exchanged, right? So you end up where the market dictates or says that the value of these pieces of these games is maybe even tens or hundreds of times the amount that they would actually be worth if this ruse or this facade hadn't taken place.
Yeah, I think in the same video, he goes back and looks at the history of some of the people involved. So some of the figures that are sort of supposed to be behind this, the certification board people who just invent a company that basically starts certifying games, I think in 2018. And some of the major sales that you're sort of talking about when you think about the big numbers in the last few years come through there. They used to be, I think, watch speculators or something like that from the 80s. And they actually got charged and didn't do time. I think they paid a lot of fines, but paid like, $1 million fines. So there's a bunch of that stuff behind the scenes for sure. In terms of how to like position what things would be like if that hadn't happened, it's hard to say. I think the popular stuff would still have gone up a lot during the pandemic, just because people want it, and that's a general sort of market thing that would happen. I know that trying to get Nintendo games, I've been trying to collect Wii games a bit. Anything first party is almost out of the question. It's too much. GameCube as well. But then something like original Xbox is just fine, which is interesting, right? So the perception of value over time is always interesting. I don't know.
Wii U, I heard, is going up too now.
Is this since the closure or?
No, this was a couple of weeks ago. For good, like, if you want to know how this like retro game collecting is going, there's a podcast called Collector's Quest, and that's sort of what I listen to. And they actually interviewed the guy from WATA in like 2018 or 2019, like before the pandemic when they first started, and then have been sort of like listening to them. Like they are kind of high spender collectors, I would call them, that all have like middle class job and live in houses in like the Midwest in the US. The sort of like the sort of like podcaster milieu of like having a decent job and having enough time to like do a podcast. But yeah, I forgot where I was going. Anyways, they are very much talk a lot about speculators. So if you want to kind of dip in, Collector's Quest is an interesting podcast to check out to just see sort of their, sort of where collecting is at right now.
That seems cool. I'll check that out for sure.
And while we're still on this topic, I think another thing that would be a really great talking point is to talk about the middle ground that is products like the EverDrive. For people who are passionate about playing on original hardware or want that experience that's as close to that, that tinted nostalgia as possible. I think they really provide a great middle ground, something where you can go and load up your entire collection of games or, abandonware, let's say, titles or anything you can legally get on that EverDrive, and you can boot up on the original hardware. That's amazing to me that you can get that essentially original experience without having to go and spend thousands of dollars to stack a shelf full of jewel cases.
Yeah, playing ROM hacks or like original like Game Boy actual GBC Game Boy games that have been made recently, translations. Yes, sorry, Alex mentioned that. On like your Game Boy. Like I don't have EverDrives. EverDrives are kind of the high end, top quality kind of flash carts, but I have a Game Boy flash cart for Game Boy Color, and then a flash cart for and using flash cart isn't quite right, for Game Boy Advance, and then one of those other ones for like the DS. But yeah, they're great for just having it, plugging it in, using proper hardware. It's like almost as good as using the games, except you don't have that sort of phenomenological kind of physical experience of like cracking open the case of like, say, a Sega Genesis and plugging it in. But it's the next best thing for using original hardware for sure.
It definitely doesn't force you to go out and get new controllers, which may be slightly different, that sort of thing. You talked about the 8-bit DO and the retro-bit controllers as part of your setup. I think it was you, Patrick.
Yep.
Those are cool in some ways, and I wanted to point this out because they actually use the tool and die from Sega. Like it's just the same hardware design for the controller, and Retrobit has licensed the controller, and Sega is like probably more magnetic as a company than you'd expect. They make money, I'm sure, but they're willing to do that, whereas Nintendo isn't. So you can get, basically as official as possible controllers that are new in 2020, which is weird, but really cool. One of the things this made me think of is dev tools. One of the ways that Mega Drive and EverDrives and other flash carts are useful is with a Genesis or Super Nintendo back in the day, to output your code to actually see it running on something, you had to have a dev kit. And I think the process, there's a video by the developer of a game called Tanglewood, which is a homebrew Genesis game, because he developed this all on one of the last remaining original dev kits. It just doesn't exist anymore because they break down. But I think to see your code run, you actually had to output it to the device and then put it on your CRT, which is really intense. But now with emulation, you can just see it. You can see the ROM file, and with Mega EverDrives, you can see it on original hardware as well. So for devs, it's been sort of for the last, I don't know how many years EverDrives have been around. They're also FPGAs, by the way. They're another implementation of that, just a smaller one. It's not a console-based thing. Well, it is a console-based thing, but it emulates other parts, if that makes sense.
The idea of like the dev kits made me think a bit. I'm not hyper familiar with the analog, I was excited to see that it had paired with GB Studio, and like that it's kind of the idea of making new games for in the guise of old games, like kind of like making new old games. I thought was something super interesting, or being able to make games for older hardware, or emulators replicating older hardware. But that's, I don't know where if it's worth dwelling on. We can go to the next question.
Oh yeah, that's so cool though. Yeah, I ordered an analog pocket, so I'm getting it sometime in 2023, but I'm very excited.
Nice. Yeah. The integration and the tools, those are all sort of volunteer community sort of projects, right? Game Boy Studio, you can get it at itch.io and a few other places. There's another one called SGDK, which is Sega Genesis Development Kit, and it takes all of the low-level assembly programming you'd have to do to make a game, and it lets you do that in a high-level language, which introduces a lot of modern conveniences in terms of, just coding and the experience of developing, and the fact that people don't learn assembly in the same way that they used to, right? So there's lots of advantages and just ways that the community has endeavored to maintain and augment sort of the experience even of developing a game, never mind playing and all the other things that sort of help, that they've helped with now. All these things we're talking about, the products and stuff, they're pretty available. I don't know if we're going to put up links and whatever, but Crix is the developer of a lot of them, or the EverDrives. There's also a company called Terra Onion. And these are companies, but I think of them, interestingly enough, as sort of consumer adjacent in the ways that they're practicing things and they're doing preservation in a way that the big companies aren't. So yes, they're out there and making money, and there's a profit to be had. They're making products, but the sort of focus of those products is, I think, more sustainable, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting sort of synergy between sort of there's this original design that Nintendo or Sega, whoever makes, and that platform is used for 10 or 15 years or whatever it is, and you get to see all the amazing things that comes out of that. But then now in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, there's been new Genesis games every year, and I love it. And they have modern design sensibilities in some ways, and you can see that happening as well. I have many examples, but yeah, maybe we can move on.
All right, so our final question of the day is, how do we preserve digital content on storefronts when things can be delisted?
Well, is anyone familiar with the legal concept of an orphan work?
Talk about it.
Yeah, talk about it. That's new to me.
Yeah, so basically an orphan work is probably what we would refer to a lot of the time as abandonware. And it's a legal concept that I know, at least in the United States, I'm not too sure about where we are based out of in Canada, but there are certain legal protections around things that have been delisted for long enough. Actually, they kind of become pseudo-public domain. Like, you can't really sell them for a profit, but you can create access to them without it being, like, strictly prohibited. So that's one way, and services, public history services like archive.org and stuff like that, they offer a ton of abandonware titles on there. Those are obviously really important gateways and access points to this kind of stuff. But what I think in a modern context is more important is what happens to online games when their servers go down.
Yeah, I know there are like people who can somehow maintain servers for older games. I know that happens for like PS3 games, like Call of Duty games. But it's always a question. And games that kind of like, if you were to buy Cyberpunk 2077 on PS4, you're going to get a really crappy game than it is like it recently released the 1.5 update.
And see, that's just the thing to me, is like experiences that are so tied to this always online connectivity, I don't think it practically works out 25 years down the road. Like, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. 25 years in the past, we still have access to a lot of that software as abandonware and as orphan works. Not necessarily so 25 years from now with games like, Cyberpunk, where we can't even get access to a functional version of it without finding the patches.
Yeah, I mean, I find that interesting. I feel like people are going to try and make things like that work. One thing that I worry about are the games that like nobody cares about. Like, so for example, like the like hordes of Flash games. I like, it makes me sad that there are so many Flash games that you can't play. But I mean, thankfully we have archive.org. We have Newgrounds has I downloaded it recently, the Newgrounds player, so you can still play a bunch of Flash games, but there are still like so many just like games that we'll never play. Twine, the like Twine, man, I forget that even the Twine website isn't around anymore. It's just archival, but like, we might lose stuff just because internet's so full of, garbage that it's just going to bury other garbage, but useful garbage that I care about.
It's a question of like, how do you play WoW as if it were, the year that it started as well? Like MMOs is a huge thing. I always wonder because there's so many updates, right? And they're logged somewhere technically, but that's not something where if someone hasn't been taking an active hand and sort of trying to preserve that they'll have it already there. It's hard. Oh, Frank Cifaldi is he used to be, so he's head of the Video Game History Foundation now, and I think that's the context we're interested in. He did a GDC talk actually on emulation. I think he's part of Digital Eclipse, or was as well. So he's a big sort of hand in trying to preserve games. His approach has always been, I think the analogy he uses is like, if we can get every John Candy movie on Amazon Prime and on Apple and Google, why can't we play old games that are, a bit obscure at this point, that have sort of had history sort of turn over them a few times? Why don't we have the same sort of accessibility and access? And he believes emulation is the answer. There's a bunch of GDC talks that are worth checking into there. Do you have more things to add about Frank Cifaldi, Patrick, or is that just the...
No, I just think he's a huge name in video game preservation, and I realized we hadn't mentioned him yet, and he's definitely an important figure.
For sure. There's lots of, we could talk about that if you wanted. Just thinking about all the resources the community sort of produced for people like Frank Cifaldi. Jeremy Parrish does a podcast you can support on a Patreon if you want, called Retronauts. It has been for 15 years or something. I don't know if I'm dating myself, but back in the oneup.com days, it's like one of the first podcasts about games, retro games. And one of the first sort of publications doing podcasts in a concerted way was oneup.com. So they've been doing that forever. They revisit things. He also works for Limited Run Games, Jeremy Parrish, so they do re-releases of old games as well as physical editions of new games. They also try to include all the patches up to a certain point where they can, which is one of those things you'd like. But for people that really want that tangible, opening, that new game smell or whatever, when you open a case, then that's probably the one of the places to go. Strictly Limited Games. There's British versions, so there's all kinds of sort of cottage industry, we'll say in terms of scope, companies that are coming out of the woodwork to support this thing. We didn't talk about analog. I feel like we're missing a lot of things. Oh, I'll stop now. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's just the thing, is there's so many things to be touched on and talked about in terms of like preservation and conservation when it comes to video games. Like, I know a lot of what I'm really interested in is the conservation of like original arcade experiences, because I mean, going to arcade as a kid for me, whether I was in a theater or a bowling alley or even a dedicated place, were some of the most memorable experiences from my childhood. And every single one of those cabinets, especially a lot of the more extravagant ones, are unique in their own way. But I mean, we could have a conversation for an hour just on that topic, right? So it's very difficult for us to kind of touch base on all the points I think we want to.
All right, then. With that being said, does anyone have any final points they want to put?
I was just going to say that there's been I don't know, for the person who's never heard about any of this, who just had us throw down all that stuff, I think the best way is if you want to find a certain kind of experience, then you can start investigating that pretty easily, just using the internet, and there's a ton of resources out there. Like if you want to play Super Mario World, you can find a way, sort of situation. And if you're the person who's sort of on the other side of that spectrum, who's looking at like how to do arcade super accurately and emulate a bunch of different boards, as opposed to having them all in your apartment, which is super space limiting, then there's those kinds of resources as well. A place called retrorgb.com is a good one, if anyone's interested.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for coming out to talk about this, and thank you all for joining and participating in this thrilling and very dense discussion, if I'm being honest. But if everyone just wants to go down the list again and introduce themselves, say where you can be found on social media if you want, that'd be great.
So that's me. My name is Andrew Bailey. As a reminder, I'm the section head of essays at First Person Scholar, and you can find me at Andrew_R_Bailey on Twitter. If you spend time on Twitter.
My name is Colin. Again, I'm an assistant editor in the commentary section. You can find me on Instagram as CW Glassworks, where you'll find some of my weird, monstrous creations in glass. And yeah, I really appreciate the chance to be here this month. So thanks for having me, Joey.
Yeah, thanks for having me, everybody. My name's Alex. You can find me streaming on Twitch at Super Combo Tech. We do a bunch of old game comparisons and a few other things, as well as... no, that's it, actually. I don't have any social media stuff to talk about now. Thanks again for having me. It was great.
It was a pleasure to have you on. And I'm Patrick Dolden, co-EIC of FPS. And I'm not really on social media, but I'd like to plug X University's Center for Digital Humanities. And they do like a bunch of just online things that, I mean, I guess this is partly self-serving. I'm going to be streaming a game for them on my Twitch, Dr. Sandmonster, on March 30th. But they do a lot of like online game-related stuff. And they're awesome.
And I'm still Joey. You can find me at _foolsbait on Twitter, and I am the podcast producer. Thanks for listening to the First Person Podcast. You can find us at FPS Weekly, or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with support from the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.